Marcus Wellington III adjusted his custom Italian suit as he stepped out of his Rolls-Royce Phantom. The valet who rushed to take his keys received nothing more than a dismissive wave. Marcus owned half the restaurants in the city, but tonight he chose to dine at Romano's, a family-owned establishment that had somehow managed to avoid his acquisition attempts for 3 years. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. "Mr. Wellington, what an honor. Your usual table." "Obviously," Marcus replied, not bothering to look at the man. He followed the nervous host through the crowded restaurant, noting how other diners whispered and pointed. Fame had its advantages, though Marcus preferred the fear that came with his reputation. Romano's buzzed with evening energy. Families celebrated anniversaries, couples shared intimate dinners, and business associates discussed deals over wine. The warm lighting cast a golden glow over checkered tablecloths, and the aroma of fresh basil and garlic filled the air. It was exactly the kind of authentic atmosphere that Marcus found both charming and profitable. His table sat in the center of the main dining room, perfectly positioned for maximum visibility. Marcus liked being seen. He liked knowing that everyone around him understood exactly who held the real power in this city. As he settled into his chair, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through acquisition reports. Tommy Rodriguez had been working at Romano's for 8 months. At 19, he was still learning the intricate dance of fine dining service. His black slacks were pressed, his white shirt spotless, and his tie perfectly knotted. Tonight felt different, though. The restaurant was busier than usual, and Tommy could sense the tension among the senior staff whenever they glanced toward table 7. "That's Marcus Wellington," whispered Elena, a veteran server with 15 years of experience. "Be extra careful around him. He owns half the city and has zero patience for mistakes." Tommy nodded, balancing a tray of appetizers for table 12. He had heard stories about Wellington's business practices, how he bought struggling restaurants only to gut their character and turn them into generic chain locations. The thought made Tommy's stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. He had a job to do. The evening progressed smoothly until Tommy was assigned to serve Wellington's table. His hands trembled slightly as he approached with a basket of fresh bread and olive oil. Wellington didn't acknowledge his presence, continuing to speak loudly into his phone about some property acquisition. "The zoning committee will approve it," Wellington was saying. "They always do when the price is right. These mom and pop places never see it coming until it's too late." Tommy set the bread down gently and began to pour water into Wellington's glass. The billionaire gestured wildly while talking, and Tommy had to pause mid-pour to avoid being hit. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy said quietly. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials?" Wellington held up one finger without looking at him, continuing his phone conversation. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, Harrison. These people think their little restaurants are precious, but business is business. Romano's will be mine within 6 months." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. This man was actively plotting to destroy the place that had given him a chance when no other restaurant would hire an inexperienced teenager. Tommy's jaw clenched, but he maintained his professional composure. Across the restaurant, an older man sat alone at a corner table. Chuck Norris had come to Romano's for 23 years, ever since moving to the city. He preferred the quiet corner where he could enjoy his meal in peace while observing the life of the restaurant around him. At 73, Chuck had seen enough of the world to recognize different types of people quickly. He watched the young waiter struggle to serve the loud businessman in the center of the room. Chuck had dealt with plenty of bullies during his martial arts career and later as an actor. There was something about arrogant wealth that brought out the worst in certain people, and this Wellington character was setting off every alarm bell in Chuck's experienced mind. Chuck's enhanced hearing, trained from decades of martial arts practice, picked up fragments of Wellington's phone conversation. The man was planning to buy and destroy this very restaurant, talking about it as if the families who worked here didn't matter at all. Tommy returned to Wellington's table with the Caesar salad the billionaire had ordered. As he approached, Wellington suddenly stood up, still talking on his phone and gesturing dramatically. Tommy tried to time his approach, but Wellington spun around unexpectedly. The collision was inevitable. Tommy, committed to his approach with the heavy tray, couldn't stop in time. The Caesar salad flew through the air, landing squarely on Wellington's custom suit. Croutons scattered across the floor, and Caesar dressing splattered across the billionaire's silk tie. The entire restaurant fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused halfway to every mouth. The only sound was the gentle jazz music playing through the speakers, suddenly, seeming inappropriate for the tension that filled the air. Wellington ended his phone call with a sharp jab at his screen. His face turned red as he looked down at his ruined $1,000 suit. "You incompetent little fool," he shouted, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tommy's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I'm so sorry, sir." You turned around suddenly, and I couldn't stop in time. "Let me help clean, help?" Wellington's voice rose even higher. "You've destroyed a suit worth more than you make in 6 months. This is exactly why places like this fail. No proper training, no standards, no respect for people who actually matter." The other diners began to murmur uncomfortably. Several families with children looked around nervously, unsure whether they should leave. The romantic atmosphere of the evening was rapidly dissolving into something ugly and unpredictable. Mr. Romano himself appeared from the kitchen, his face pale with worry. At 62, he had built this restaurant from nothing, working 18-hour days for 3 decades. "Mr. Wellington, please accept our sincere apologies. We'll pay for the cleaning, naturally. Tommy is a good worker. He didn't mean." Wellington turned his fury on the restaurant owner. "I don't care what he meant. This is exactly the kind of amateur operation I expected from this place. Maybe it's time someone with actual business sense took control here." Chuck Norris set down his water glass carefully. He had been enjoying a peaceful dinner, but watching this display of cruelty toward a young man who was clearly trying his best activated something deep inside him. Chuck had spent his life standing up to bullies, and some habits never died. Wellington wasn't finished with his tantrum. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of his stained suit. "This is going straight to my lawyers. Negligence, hostile work environment, inadequate training. I'll own this place by Christmas." Tommy stood frozen, sauce still dripping from his hands. His eyes filled with tears of frustration and embarrassment. Around him, his coworkers watched helplessly, knowing their jobs depended on keeping wealthy customers happy, even when those customers were clearly wrong. "And you," Wellington pointed a manicured finger at Tommy, "are fired. I don't care who hired you or why. Romano's doesn't need employees who assault customers." "Assault?" Tommy's voice cracked. "It was an accident. You moved into me while I was serving. Are you arguing with me?" Wellington stepped closer, using his height and expensive cologne as intimidation tactics. "Do you know who I am? I could have you blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. No one would hire you to clean toilets when I'm finished." The threat hung in the air like poison. Several servers exchanged worried glances, knowing that Wellington had the power to follow through on his words. The restaurant industry in the city was smaller than people realized, and a bad word from someone like Wellington could indeed destroy a young person's career. Chuck Norris pushed back his chair and stood up slowly. At first, no one paid attention to the older gentleman in the corner. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing in his simple jeans and button-down shirt. His movements were deliberate and calm, like someone who had never needed to rush or prove anything to anyone. Wellington was still berating Tommy when Chuck reached their table. The billionaire was in the middle of explaining how he planned to sue both Tommy and the restaurant when a quiet voice interrupted him. "Excuse me," Chuck said politely. "I couldn't help but notice the situation here." Wellington turned, irritated by the interruption. He looked Chuck up and down, taking in the older man's casual clothes and unassuming appearance. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Go back to your table." Chuck smiled slightly, the kind of smile that had intimidated countless opponents in martial arts competitions. "Actually, I think it does concern me. I've been coming to this restaurant for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone treat the staff with such disrespect." "Disrespect?" Wellington laughed harshly. "This kid ruined a suit that costs more than your car. If that's not grounds for consequences, then it was clearly an accident." Chuck interrupted, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge that made nearby diners look up from their meals. "The young man was doing his job when you moved unexpectedly. Any reasonable person could see that." Wellington's face darkened. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially by someone he perceived as beneath his social status. Listen, grandfather, I don't know what retirement home you escaped from, but this is none of your business. Go finish your soup before it gets cold. The insult hung in the air for a moment. Several people who recognized Chuck Norris gasped quietly, knowing that Wellington had just made a serious mistake. But the billionaire was too wrapped up in his own arrogance to notice the change in atmosphere. Chuck's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his posture. Decades of martial arts training had taught him to remain perfectly calm while preparing for action. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, bullying young people who are just trying to do their jobs is exactly the kind of behavior that brings out the worst in me. Bullying. Wellington laughed again, but the sound was less confident than before. I'm addressing an employee's incompetence. If you don't like it, maybe you should find a different restaurant. I hear there's a nice Denny's down the street that might be more your speed. Tommy looked between the two men, confused and overwhelmed. He had never seen anyone stand up to Marcus Wellington before, and he couldn't understand why this stranger was getting involved. The other diners had stopped pretending to eat and were openly staring at the confrontation. Chuck took a step closer to Wellington, and suddenly, the billionaire's height advantage seemed irrelevant. There was something about the older man's presence that filled the space around him, making him seem larger than his physical dimensions suggested. I think, Chuck said quietly, you owe this young man an apology. Wellington's mouth fell open. In his 43 years of life, no one had ever suggested that he should apologize to service staff. The concept was so foreign to his worldview that he struggled to process it. Apologize? He sputtered. Are you insane? He ruined my suit. He should be grateful I don't have him arrested. For what? Chuck's voice remained perfectly level. Doing his job while you gestured wildly during a phone conversation? I saw the whole thing. You moved into him, not the other way around. Wellington's face turned an even deeper shade of red. Who do you think you are? Do you have any idea how much money I have? How much power? I could buy and sell you 1,000 times over. Chuck's smile became genuinely amused. Money is nice, but it doesn't excuse bad manners. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to terrorize teenagers who are just trying to make an honest living. The confrontation was attracting attention from every corner of the restaurant. Other customers were pulling out their phones, some recording video while others called friends to describe what was happening. Social media posts were already beginning to spread the news that something extraordinary was unfolding at Romano's. Wellington, sensing the attention, tried to regain control of the situation. This conversation is over. I want both of you removed from this restaurant immediately. He looked around for Mr. Romano, but the owner was standing frozen near the kitchen door, unsure how to handle a situation that had spiraled far beyond normal customer service protocols. I'm not going anywhere, Chuck said simply. Not until you apologize to Tommy for your inappropriate behavior. The standoff stretched into what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Wellington, surrounded by the watching crowd, felt his authority slipping away. He had built his fortune on intimidation and the assumption that money could solve any problem. But this ordinary-looking older man seemed completely immune to both tactics. Fine, Wellington said through gritted teeth. You want to play games? Let me make a phone call. Security will remove both of you. And then we'll see how tough you are when you're explaining this to the police. Chuck's expression didn't change. Go ahead and make your call. But I should probably mention something first. What? Wellington snapped, already reaching for his phone. My name is Chuck Norris. The words fell into the restaurant like stones into still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread from table to table. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones appeared as people tried to capture what was clearly about to become a legendary moment. The silence in Romano's was so complete that the gentle hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Marcus Wellington stood frozen, his expensive phone still clutched in his manicured hand, staring at the man who had just identified himself as Chuck Norris. The billionaire's brain struggled to process this new information while his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Tommy Rodriguez looked between the two men, confusion evident on his young face. He had heard the name Chuck Norris, of course, but looking at this ordinary-seeming older gentleman in jeans and a casual shirt, he couldn't quite connect the dots. The name meant something important, judging by the way every adult in the restaurant had suddenly gone completely silent. You're joking. Wellington finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. This is some kind of elaborate prank. Chuck reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. With the same calm precision he had shown throughout the confrontation, he extracted his driver's license and held it up for Wellington to see. The plastic card caught the restaurant's warm lighting, clearly displaying the name Carlos Ray Norris along with an address in Texas. Wellington squinted at the license, his face growing paler by the second. The photo was unmistakably the man standing before him, and the name left no room for doubt. Marcus Wellington III, who had bulldozed his way through business deals and intimidated countless competitors, was face-to-face with a living legend. Around the restaurant, people were beginning to whisper excitedly. Cell phones appeared from purses and pockets as diners realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The Romano family's restaurant, which had been serving traditional Italian food for 3 decades, was about to become the setting for what would likely become internet folklore. "Oh my God, it really is him," whispered a woman at table 4 to her husband. "That's actually Chuck Norris." An elderly gentleman near the window pulled out his reading glasses for a better look. "I saw him in Missing in Action when I was young. Never thought I'd see him in person." The recognition spread through the restaurant like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone remembered exactly who Chuck Norris was and why his presence changed everything about the situation they were witnessing. This wasn't just any customer defending a young waiter anymore. This was a martial arts legend, a movie star, and, according to internet culture, a man capable of impossible feats. Wellington's hands began to shake slightly. His carefully constructed persona of wealth and power felt suddenly fragile in the presence of someone whose reputation was built on actual achievement rather than inherited money. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice dropping to a much more respectful tone, "I had no idea who you were. Perhaps we can discuss this situation more privately?" Chuck put his wallet away with the same deliberate movements he had used to retrieve it. "I don't think privacy is necessary. The situation is quite simple. You owe Tommy an apology for your behavior. And then, we can all continue enjoying our evening." Tommy finally understood who had been defending him, and his eyes widened with amazement. Growing up, he had watched Chuck Norris movies with his grandfather, laughing at the internet jokes about his superhuman abilities. To have this legendary figure standing up for him felt surreal, like something from one of those very movies. "Mr. Norris," Tommy stammered, "I can't believe. I mean, thank you for standing up for me, but you don't need to get involved in this. I can handle." "Nonsense," Chuck interrupted gently. "Bullies only understand one language, and it's not politeness." Mr. Wellington here was being unnecessarily cruel to someone who was simply doing their job. Wellington's business instincts, honed by decades of corporate warfare, began to kick in despite his shock. He realized that this confrontation was being recorded by multiple people and would likely appear on social media within minutes. His reputation, carefully managed by an expensive public relations firm, could suffer serious damage if he didn't handle this situation correctly. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Wellington said, attempting to regain some composure. "I was simply expressing frustration about my ruined suit. Surely you can understand that a man in my position expects a certain level of service." Chuck's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't buying Wellington's attempt at damage control. "I understand perfectly. A man in your position should be setting an example of how to treat working people with respect. Instead, you chose to humiliate a teenager in front of a room full of strangers." Mr. Romano, who had been watching the confrontation from near the kitchen, finally approached the table. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his apron. At 62, he had seen difficult customers before, but nothing like this situation. "Mr. Norris," he said with heavily accented English, "it is an honor to have you in my restaurant. I am so sorry about this trouble. Please, your meal tonight is complimentary, and perhaps we can—" "That's very kind of you, Mr. Romano," Chuck interrupted. "But this isn't about compensation. This is about treating your employees with the respect they deserve. Tommy was doing his job when this accident occurred, and no one should be subjected to verbal abuse because of an honest mistake." Wellington, sensing an opportunity to salvage the situation, jumped back into the conversation. Of course, you're absolutely right. Perhaps I overreacted. The stress of business, you understand. I withdraw my complaint against the young man. That's a start, Chuck acknowledged. But it's not enough. An apology would be appropriate. The billionaire's face tightened. Apologizing to service staff went against every instinct he had developed during his rise to wealth and power. His father had taught him that weakness was the enemy of success, and admitting fault to someone he considered beneath his social status felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything he believed. An apology seems excessive, Wellington said carefully. I'm willing to overlook the incident and even pay for professional cleaning of my suit. Surely that demonstrates sufficient goodwill. Chuck took a step closer to Wellington, and the billionaire instinctively stepped back. The movement was subtle but noticeable to everyone watching. Here was one of the wealthiest men in the city backing down from a 73-year-old martial artist in jeans. Let me share something with you, Mr. Wellington, Chuck said in a conversational tone that somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. I've met presidents, kings, and some of the most powerful people in the world. You know what I learned from those experiences? Wellington shook his head, not trusting his voice. The truly powerful people are the ones who treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position in life. The weak ones are the ones who need to prove their importance by putting others down. The words hit Wellington like physical blows. Around the restaurant, people nodded in agreement with Chuck's wisdom. Several diners began to applaud quietly, showing their support for what the martial arts legend was saying. A young mother at table 6 whispered to her daughter, "That's what real strength looks like, honey. Standing up for people who can't defend themselves." Tommy wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the support he was receiving from a complete stranger. His parents had immigrated to America when he was young, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities their son never could have had in their home country. The idea that someone like Chuck Norris would defend his dignity meant more than Wellington could possibly understand. Elena, the veteran server who had warned Tommy about Wellington earlier, approached the group cautiously. Her 15 years of experience at Romano's had taught her to read difficult situations, and she could see that this confrontation was reaching a critical moment. "Excuse me," she said respectfully, "but perhaps we could resolve this situation in a way that allows everyone to maintain their dignity." Chuck turned to Elena with interest. "What do you suggest?" "Well," Elena continued, glancing nervously at Wellington, "accidents happen in restaurants every day. Professional cleaners can remove almost any stain from clothing, and insurance covers these kinds of incidents. If Mr. Wellington could find it in his heart to accept Tommy's sincere regret about the accident, perhaps we could all move forward positively." Wellington seized on Elena's diplomatic solution like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "Yes, exactly. A mature, businesslike resolution. I accept the young man's regret. We arrange for professional cleaning, and everyone can return to their evening." But Chuck wasn't satisfied with corporate speak disguised as resolution. "That's still not an apology, Mr. Wellington. Elena's suggestion is reasonable, but it doesn't address your inappropriate behavior toward Tommy. The accident was minor compared to the verbal assault that followed." The standoff continued as Wellington struggled with the impossible choice between his ego and his growing awareness that this situation could seriously damage his reputation. Social media was a powerful force, and videos of wealthy people behaving badly had a way of going viral with devastating consequences. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant. "Sir, Twitter is already talking about an incident at Romano's. Please advise on damage control strategy." Wellington's blood ran cold. His public relations team had spent years crafting his image as a successful but approachable businessman. Charitable donations, carefully staged photo opportunities, and strategic media placements had created a persona that was crucial to his business empire's continued success. "Mr. Norris," Wellington said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "surely a man of your stature can understand the pressures of public life. Perhaps we could discuss this situation privately, away from all these cameras." Chuck glanced around the restaurant, noting the dozens of phones pointed in their direction. "I think the public nature of this discussion is exactly what's needed. You chose to humiliate Tommy in front of all these people. If you're going to make amends, it should be equally public." Tommy stepped forward, his confidence growing with Chuck's continued support. Mr. Wellington, I really am sorry about your suit. I never meant for the accident to happen. But what you said about having me blacklisted from every restaurant in the city, that was just cruel. Wellington looked at the young man's earnest face and felt an unfamiliar emotion, shame. For a brief moment, he saw the situation from Tommy's perspective. Here was a teenager working hard to support himself, probably sending money to family members, trying to build a future through honest work. Wellington's threats could indeed destroy those dreams. And for what? A stained suit that could be cleaned or replaced without any meaningful impact on his vast wealth. Perhaps, Wellington said slowly, I was harsher than necessary in my initial reaction. Chuck waited patiently, saying nothing but making it clear that vague admissions weren't sufficient. The pressure from dozens of watching eyes finally broke through Wellington's resistance. Tommy, he said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable, I apologize for my inappropriate response to the accident. You were doing your job, and I should not have threatened your livelihood over a minor mishap. Tommy's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. Chuck nodded approvingly. That's better. And I think Elena's suggestion about handling the cleaning costs through normal business channels is perfectly reasonable. Wellington felt a wave of relief wash over him. The crisis seemed to be passing, and he could already imagine how his public relations team would spin this story. Billionaire shows humility in restaurant incident could actually play well if handled correctly. But Chuck Norris wasn't quite finished. There's one more thing we should discuss, Mr. Wellington. Wellington's newfound relief evaporated. What's that? I couldn't help but overhear part of your phone conversation earlier. Something about acquiring Romano's restaurant within 6 months. The blood drained from Wellington's face completely. He had forgotten that his plans for hostile takeover had been discussed openly during his earlier phone call. Mr. Romano, who had been listening quietly to the apology exchange, suddenly looked confused and concerned. Acquiring my restaurant? Mr. Romano asked, his accent thickening with emotion. Mr. Wellington, what does this mean? Wellington found himself trapped between his business ambitions and the growing scrutiny of everyone in the restaurant. The cell phone cameras that had captured his apology were still recording, and any admission of predatory business practices would be preserved forever on social media. That was just preliminary business discussion, Wellington stammered. Nothing concrete, just exploring opportunities in the restaurant sector. Chuck's smile returned, but it wasn't particularly warm. It sounded the atmosphere in Romano's had shifted from tense confrontation to something far more serious. Mr. Romano stood near his family's table, his weathered hands gripping the back of a chair as he processed the implications of what Chuck Norris had revealed. The restaurant that had been his life's work, the place where he had raised his children and built his dreams, was apparently under threat from the very man he had been trying to appease. 30 years, Mr. Romano said quietly, his voice thick with emotion and his Italian accent more pronounced than usual. 30 years I build this place from nothing. My wife, she work here until the cancer take her. My children, they grow up in this kitchen, learning to make the sauce from their grandmother's recipe. Wellington looked around the restaurant desperately, seeking some escape from the situation that was spiraling completely out of his control. The cell phones continued recording, and he could practically feel his carefully constructed reputation crumbling with each passing second. His public relations team would have a nightmare trying to spin this story. Chuck Norris remained perfectly calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't going to let this matter drop. Mr. Wellington, I think everyone here deserves to understand exactly what kind of business practices you were discussing on that phone call. That was a private conversation, Wellington protested weakly. Business discussions taken out of context can be easily misinterpreted. Context seemed pretty clear to me. Chuck replied evenly. You were explaining to someone named Harrison how you plan to acquire this restaurant through questionable zoning committee approvals. Something about these places never seeing it coming until it's too late. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. Not only had Chuck Norris defended him from Wellington's abuse, but now the legendary martial artist was protecting the entire restaurant from what sounded like a corporate conspiracy. It was like watching a real-life superhero movie unfold before his eyes. Elena, who had worked at Romano's longer than anyone except Mr. Romano himself, felt her anger building as she understood what Wellington had been planning. You were going to steal this restaurant? After eating here for months, pretending to be a valued customer? Wellington's corporate instincts kicked in, and he attempted to regain control through the kind of legal intimidation that had served him well in business. I want to be very clear that any recordings of private conversations could constitute illegal surveillance. There could be serious legal consequences for anyone who— Are you threatening these people now? Chuck interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made everyone in the restaurant pay attention. Because that would be a very poor decision on your part. The threat in Chuck's tone was subtle but unmistakable. Wellington, despite his wealth and influence, found himself backing down once again from the 73-year-old martial artist. The billionaire was beginning to realize that money and lawyers weren't going to get him out of this situation. A young man at table 9 had been recording the entire confrontation on his phone and, suddenly, spoke up. Mr. Norris, sir, this is already trending on Twitter. Hashtag Chuck Norris Restaurant is getting thousands of retweets. People are calling you a hero for standing up to corporate bullying. Wellington's face went ashen. Social media could destroy reputations faster than any traditional media outlet, and the story was apparently spreading beyond the confines of Romano's restaurant. His phone began buzzing insistently with calls from his media team, board members, and business partners. I need to take these calls, Wellington said, pulling out his phone. This conversation is over. No, Chuck said firmly. This conversation continues until we resolve the question of your intentions toward Mr. Romano's restaurant. These people deserve to know whether their livelihoods are under threat. Mr. Romano approached Wellington directly, his dignity intact despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. Mr. Wellington, please, I ask you as one businessman to another. This restaurant is all my family has. We never hurt anyone. We just try to serve good food and make honest living. Why you want to destroy us? The simple, heartfelt question hung in the air like an accusation. Wellington looked around the restaurant and, for the first time, really saw the place he had been planning to acquire. Family photos covered one wall, showing 3 generations of the Romano family celebrating birthdays, graduations, and anniversaries within these same walls. The checkered tablecloths were worn but clean, lovingly maintained. Fresh herbs grew in window boxes, adding their fragrance to the warm atmosphere. This wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a family's heritage, a community gathering place, a piece of authentic culture in an increasingly corporate world. Wellington had never bothered to consider the human cost of his acquisitions before, but under Chuck Norris's steady gaze and surrounded by the expectant faces of the staff and customers, he couldn't avoid confronting that reality. It's not personal, Wellington said weakly. It's just business. The location has significant development potential, and the current use isn't maximizing the property's value. Not personal. Chuck's voice carried a note of disbelief. Mr. Romano, how many people work here? 14 regular employees, Mr. Romano answered. Some of them work here 10, 15 years. Elena, she started when she was Tommy's age. Marcus, my sous chef, he come from Sicily when his family was in trouble. We are not just restaurant. We are family. Chuck turned back to Wellington. So your business decision would put 14 families out of work, destroy a 3-generation family legacy, and eliminate a beloved community gathering place. Also, you can build another generic development and add to your already vast fortune. Wellington felt cornered and desperate. His usual tactics of intimidation and legal threats weren't working, and the social media attention was making any attempt at quiet resolution impossible. You don't understand the complexities of urban development, he said, grasping for any argument that might justify his position. Sometimes older establishments need to make way for progress. It's economic evolution. Evolution. Elena stepped forward, her 15 years of experience giving her the confidence to speak up. You want to know about evolution? I started here as a teenager, just like Tommy. Mr. Romano taught me about food, about service, about treating people with respect. I put myself through college working here. I bought my first car with tips from these tables. I met my husband here when he came in for dinner on a first date with someone else. She smiled at the memory. He married me instead, 3 years later. That's evolution. That's growth. not tearing down something beautiful to build another strip mall. Her words resonated through the restaurant. Other diners began to nod in agreement, and several people shared their own memories of special occasions celebrated at Romano's. The young couple at table 4 mentioned their first anniversary dinner. The elderly gentleman by the window talked about bringing his late wife here for their monthly date nights. Wellington realized he was facing something far more powerful than business opposition. He was up against emotional attachment, community bonds, and shared history. These weren't just customers and employees arguing against his acquisition. These were people defending something they loved. His phone buzzed with a text from his head of public relations. "Sir, this is becoming a PR disaster. We need immediate damage control. Whatever you're doing, stop doing it, and apologize for everything." Chuck seemed to sense Wellington's internal struggle. "Mr. Wellington, I've been in situations where I had to make difficult choices between what was easy and what was right. The easy choice is usually the one that serves your immediate interests. The right choice is the one you can live with when you're looking at yourself in the mirror 20 years from now. You don't understand the business world," Wellington said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Competition, market forces, investor expectations, I understand perfectly," Chuck interrupted. "I've built businesses, created jobs, and worked with investors. But I've never done it at the expense of destroying something beautiful that other people built with their own hands and hearts." Tommy, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Wellington, can I ask you something?" Wellington looked at the young man who had started this entire confrontation. "What? Do you have kids?" The question caught Wellington off guard. "I have a daughter. She's 16. What does she want to be when she grows up?" Wellington frowned, unsure where this conversation was headed. "She wants to be a teacher. Elementary school, specifically. She loves working with children." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "That's beautiful. Teachers are so important. When she's working with those kids, helping them learn and grow, would you want someone to come along and shut down her school because the land could be worth more as a shopping center?" The analogy hit Wellington like a physical blow. For the first time, he saw the parallel between his daughter's future calling to nurture and educate young minds, and what the Romano family had built in their restaurant. Both were about serving others, creating something meaningful beyond pure profit. That's different," Wellington said. But even he could hear the weakness in his argument. "How?" Tommy pressed gently. "You said it yourself. It's not personal, it's just business. But everything important in life is personal, isn't it? Your daughter's dreams are personal. Mr. Romano's life work is personal. The jobs that feed Elena's family are personal." Chuck watched this exchange with growing respect for the young waiter. Tommy was demonstrating a wisdom and emotional intelligence that many adults never developed. The kid had taken a terrible situation and turned it into a teaching moment, not through anger or revenge, but through genuine human connection. Wellington's phone rang insistently. The caller ID showed his daughter's name, and, without thinking, he answered it. "Dad?" came a young voice through the speaker, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I saw something on social media about you being in some kind of argument at a restaurant. Are you okay?" Wellington looked around at the faces surrounding him. Chuck Norris, Tommy, Mr. Romano, Elena, and dozens of other people who were watching his every move. His daughter's innocent concern contrasted sharply with the corporate ruthlessness he had been displaying all evening. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said into the phone. "Just having a discussion about business. The videos make it look pretty intense. Dad, you know how much I hate it when people are mean to service workers. Please tell me you weren't being one of those awful customers who yells at waiters." Wellington closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his daughter's disappointed tone. She had clearly seen enough of the social media coverage to understand exactly what kind of person her father had been that evening. "Madison," he said quietly, "I'll call you back in a few minutes." "Dad, just remember what you always told me about treating people the Walmarcus Wellington 3 stood in the center of Romano's restaurant, feeling the weight of every eye in the room focused on him. The phone call from his daughter had shattered something inside his carefully constructed armor of corporate ruthlessness. For the first time in years, he was seeing his own behavior through the eyes of someone whose opinion truly mattered to him. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Wellington struggled to find words that could somehow repair the damage he had done. Chuck Norris waited patiently, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. Tommy Rodriguez stood nearby, his young face showing a mixture of hope and skepticism. Mr. Romano clutched his wife's rosary, a habit he had developed since her death, whenever he faced moments of extreme stress. Mr. Romano, Wellington began again, his voice shaking slightly. I promise you that not only will I abandon any plans to acquire your restaurant, but I will do everything in my power to protect this place and others like it from the kind of predatory business practices I was planning to use. The words hung in the air like incense, slowly spreading through the restaurant as people processed what they had just heard. Elena gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Tommy's eyes widened with amazement. Even Chuck Norris looked surprised by the completeness of Wellington's reversal. Furthermore, Wellington continued, gaining momentum as he spoke. I want to establish a fund to help family-owned restaurants like Romano's survive and thrive in an increasingly corporate world. Local businesses are the heart of any community, and I've been too blind to see that. Mr. Romano's eyes filled with tears as he understood that his life's work was not only safe, but would be actively protected by the very man who had threatened it. Mr. Wellington, I don't know what to say. Say you'll forgive a foolish old businessman who forgot what really matters in life, Wellington replied. Say you'll let me learn from your example of how to treat people with dignity and respect. Chuck stepped forward, extending his hand to Wellington. That takes real courage, admitting you were wrong in front of all these people. I respect that. Wellington shook Chuck's hand, feeling genuinely honored by the martial arts legend's approval. Mr. Norris, I owe you a debt of gratitude. If you hadn't stood up to me tonight, I would have continued down a path that would have hurt a lot of good people. The real hero here is Tommy, Chuck said, turning to the young waiter. He showed more class and wisdom in the last hour than many people display in a lifetime. Tommy blushed at the praise, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I just wanted to do my job and treat customers well. I never expected anything like this. Wellington looked at Tommy with new eyes, seeing the potential that his earlier rage had blinded him to. Tommy, how would you like to help me establish that restaurant protection fund I mentioned? I could use someone who understands the industry from the ground up. Tommy's mouth fell open. You want me to help you? After what happened tonight? Especially because of what happened tonight, Wellington said firmly. You showed me that real strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when you're facing someone with more power than you. That's exactly the kind of character I need on my team. Elena wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Tommy's life change before her eyes. She had mentored him since his first day at Romano's, and seeing him recognized for his integrity filled her with pride. The other customers in the restaurant began to applaud, slowly at first, and then, with genuine enthusiasm. What had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something beautiful, a powerful man learning to use his influence for good instead of personal gain. Wellington's phone buzzed insistently with messages from his media team, but, for the first time in years, he ignored business communications. Mr. Romano, would it be possible for me to stay and finish dinner? I'd like to experience your restaurant the way it was meant to be experienced, not as a target for acquisition, but as a place of community and family. Mr. Romano beamed, his weathered face creasing with joy. Of course. Elena, please bring Mr. Wellington our best bottle of Chianti. Tonight we celebrate new friendships. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in Romano's transformed completely. Wellington found himself in genuine conversation with other diners, learning their stories and sharing his own journey from corporate raider to community protector. Chuck Norris regaled the restaurant with tales from his movie career, keeping everyone entertained with behind-the-scenes stories and gentle humor. Tommy worked his shift with a new confidence, knowing that his integrity had not only been recognized but rewarded. Other servers approached him throughout the evening, wanting to shake hands with the young man who had somehow turned a billionaire's wrath into an opportunity for positive change. At one point, Wellington excused himself to call his daughter back. Madison answered immediately, having been following the social media updates about the restaurant incident. Dad, the videos from the restaurant are everywhere now. People are calling it the most amazing redemption story they've ever seen. I'm so proud of you for doing the right thing. Wellington smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Your words earlier tonight reminded me what kind of father I want to be. Thank you for believing in me, even when I wasn't believing in myself. That's what family does, Dad. We help each other be better. When Wellington returned to his table, Chuck was discussing martial arts philosophy with Mr. Romano and several other diners. The conversation had turned to the importance of discipline, respect, and using strength to protect rather than intimidate. Martial arts taught me that real power comes from self-control, Chuck was explaining. Anyone can use force to get what they want, but it takes real strength to use that power responsibly. Wellington nodded thoughtfully. I built my business empire using intimidation and aggressive tactics. I told myself it was just business, but tonight I realized I was really just being a bully with expensive lawyers. A woman at a nearby table overheard and joined the conversation. My husband works in corporate finance, and he comes home every day talking about how cutthroat and unethical his industry has become. It's refreshing to hear a successful businessman admit that there might be a better way. There is definitely a better way, Wellington said with conviction. I'm going to spend the rest of my career proving that successful business and ethical behavior can coexist. As the evening wound down, Wellington insisted on personally apologizing to every member of the Romano's staff. He shook hands with the kitchen crew, thanked the busboys for their hard work, and promised Elena that her job would never be threatened by corporate acquisitions as long as he had any influence in the city. Tommy approached Wellington as the billionaire was preparing to leave. Mr. Wellington, I've been thinking about your offer to help with the restaurant fund. I'd be honored to work with you, but I also want to finish my education. I'm taking business classes at the community college. Wellington smiled. Even better. I'll pay for you to transfer to a 4-year university and study business administration. We'll structure your work with the fund as an internship that counts toward your degree. Sound good? Tommy's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. In one evening, he had gone from being threatened with unemployment to receiving a full scholarship and a career opportunity that could change his entire life. Chuck Norris stood to leave as well, having thoroughly enjoyed watching the evening's transformation. Mr. Wellington, I hope you don't mind if I keep an eye on this restaurant fund project. I'm always interested in initiatives that help working families. I wouldn't want it any other way, Wellington replied. In fact, would you consider serving on the fund's advisory board? Your reputation for integrity would lend credibility to our mission. Chuck considered the offer seriously. I'd be honored to help, as long as we're committed to transparency and genuine impact rather than publicity stunts. Agreed completely, Wellington said, extending his hand again. Partners in making sure this kind of business bullying doesn't happen to other family establishments. As Wellington finally prepared to leave, he turned to address the entire restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight as one kind of person, and I'm leaving as someone completely different. Thank you all for witnessing my transformation and holding me accountable for my behavior. Romanos will always have my protection and support. The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt. Mr. Romano embraced Wellington like an old friend, and even the kitchen staff emerged to wave goodbye to the man who had threatened their livelihoods and then become their protector. Outside the restaurant, Wellington's driver was waiting with the Rolls-Royce, but the billionaire hesitated before getting in. Through the large windows of Romano's, he could see the warm light illuminating families sharing meals, couples celebrating anniversaries, and friends enjoying each other's company. This was what he had almost destroyed in pursuit of another meaningless acquisition. He pulled out his phone and called his head of acquisitions. Harrison, it's Marcus. Cancel all pending restaurant acquisitions. Permanently. I'm getting into a different kind of business. 6 months after the infamous incident at Romano's restaurant, the story had taken on a life of its own. The video clips from that evening had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms, spawning countless memes, discussion threads, and even academic papers about corporate responsibility and community activism. But more importantly than its viral fame, the confrontation had created real, lasting change in both Marcus Wellington's life and the broader business community. The Romano Family Restaurant Protection Fund had officially launched 3 months earlier with an initial endowment of $50 million from Wellington's personal fortune. Chuck Norris had indeed joined the advisory board, lending his celebrity status and moral authority to the organization's mission. Tommy Rodriguez, now enrolled at the State University studying business administration, worked part-time as the fund's community outreach coordinator while maintaining his weekend shifts at Romano's. The fund's offices were located in a converted warehouse downtown, deliberately chosen to reflect the organization's grassroots mission rather than the typical gleaming corporate towers Wellington was known for. The walls were decorated with photographs of family restaurants from around the country, each one a success story of preservation and protection against predatory acquisition attempts. Elena Vasquez had been promoted to assistant manager at Romano's and also served as a consultant for the Protection Fund, helping to identify restaurants in need of support. Her 15 years of industry experience proved invaluable in understanding the real challenges faced by family-owned establishments trying to compete with corporate chains. On this particular Tuesday morning, Wellington sat in his fund office reviewing applications for assistance. The cases ranged from small-town diners facing highway construction that would eliminate their customer base to ethnic restaurants in gentrifying neighborhoods being priced out by rising rents. Each file represented real families whose livelihoods hung in the balance. Tommy knocked on the office door, carrying a stack of research reports he had compiled for their upcoming board meeting. At 19, he had grown into his role with the fund while continuing to excel in his university courses. The scholarship Wellington had provided included not just tuition, but also mentoring from business professors and internship opportunities that were shaping him into a formidable advocate for small businesses. Mr. Wellington, the Chicago case you wanted me to research is really interesting, Tommy said, settling into the chair across from Wellington's desk. Giuseppe's Pizza has been serving the same neighborhood for 47 years. The original owner died last year, and his daughter Angela is trying to keep the restaurant running while dealing with a corporate chain that's offering the landlord triple the current rent. Wellington reviewed the file Tommy had prepared, noting the detailed financial analysis and community impact assessment. The young man's work had become increasingly sophisticated over the past few months, combining his frontline restaurant experience with formal business education. "What's your recommendation?" Wellington asked, genuinely curious about Tommy's perspective. "I think we should offer them our comprehensive support package," Tommy said confidently. Low-interest loan to help them purchase the building, marketing consultation to help them compete with the chain, and, maybe most importantly, legal support to negotiate with the corporate landlord. Wellington smiled at Tommy's thorough analysis. The scared teenager who had spilled Caesar salad on his suit had evolved into a thoughtful advocate who understood both the emotional and business aspects of protecting family restaurants. "Approved," Wellington said, signing the authorization form. "Schedule a site visit for next week. I want to meet Angela personally and understand her vision for the restaurant's future." These site visits had become Wellington's favorite part of running the fund. Instead of conducting business from boardrooms and conference calls, he now spent his time in restaurant kitchens, talking with owners who had invested their life savings in following their dreams. The work was more fulfilling than any acquisition deal he had ever completed. Chuck Norris arrived at the fund offices just as Wellington and Tommy were finishing their application review. At 73, Chuck remained remarkably energetic, and his involvement with the fund had given him a new sense of purpose beyond his entertainment career. He had become particularly passionate about protecting restaurants owned by immigrant families, seeing their entrepreneurial spirit as embodying the best of American values. "Good morning, gentlemen," Chuck said, settling into the conference room. "I just got off the phone with the mayor's office about the zoning reform proposal. They're willing to support our initiative to restrict predatory commercial property acquisitions in historic neighborhoods." Wellington looked up from his files with interest. The zoning reform initiative had been Chuck's idea, aimed at creating legal protections for established small businesses against the kind of corporate manipulation Wellington himself had once practiced. "That's excellent news," Wellington said. "Having municipal support will make it much easier to expand the program to other cities." Tommy pulled out his laptop and began taking notes. As the fund's community outreach coordinator, he was responsible for tracking all political developments that might affect their mission. The mayor specifically mentioned the Romano's incident. Chuck continued. "She said that story changed how her administration thinks about balancing economic development with community preservation. Apparently, several other city council members have similar family restaurant stories and want to make sure their constituents don't face the same threats. Wellington nodded thoughtfully. He had testified before the city council twice in recent months, using his own transformation as an example of how business leaders could choose community benefit over pure profit maximization. The experience of publicly admitting his past wrongdoing and advocating for systemic change had been both humbling and liberating. Elena arrived for the weekly board meeting carrying samples from Romano's new catering menu. Mr. Romano had expanded the restaurant's offerings based on the increased visibility from the viral incident, and business had grown by 40% over the past 6 months. The new revenue had allowed him to give raises to all his employees and hire 2 additional kitchen staff. Mr. Romano sends his greetings, Elena said, unpacking containers of homemade pasta and sauce. He's still amazed that the worst night in the restaurant's history turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to us. Chuck chuckled as he sampled the rigatoni. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes our biggest challenges become our greatest opportunities. Wellington reflected on Chuck's words while reviewing the agenda for their meeting. 6 months earlier, he had been a different person entirely, focused solely on wealth accumulation and corporate dominance. The transformation hadn't been easy. Changing decades of ingrained behavior patterns required constant vigilance, and the support of people like Chuck, Tommy, and Elena who helped hold him accountable. His relationship with his daughter Madison had also dramatically improved. She had been so proud of his work with the fund that she had written her senior project about the intersection of business ethics and community development. Madison planned to study social entrepreneurship in college, inspired by her father's example of using wealth for positive social impact. Before we start the formal meeting, Wellington said, I want to share some news about our expansion plans. The Ford Foundation has agreed to provide matching funds for our program, which means we can double our capacity to help family restaurants across the country. Tommy's eyes widened with excitement. That's incredible. How many additional restaurants will we be able to help? Conservatively, about 200 per year, Wellington replied. But, more importantly, we'll be able to establish regional offices and hire local coordinators who understand their specific community's needs. Chuck nodded approvingly, scaling up while maintaining the personal touch that makes this program effective. I like it. Elena raised her hand tentatively. I have a suggestion about the expansion, if you don't mind. Of course, Wellington encouraged. Your input is always valuable. Well, I've been talking to other restaurant workers through my industry contacts, and many of them face situations similar to what we experienced. Maybe we could create a training program to help service staff recognize predatory business practices and know how to seek help. Wellington leaned forward with interest. Elena's suggestion aligned perfectly with the fund's mission of empowering communities to protect their own interests. That's brilliant, he said. Who better to spot potential threats than the people working in these restaurants every day? Tommy, could you research existing whistleblower protection programs and see how we might adapt them for restaurant workers? Tommy made notes enthusiastically. Absolutely. I'll also look into partnering with culinary schools and hospitality programs to integrate this training into their curricula. As their meeting progressed, Wellington found himself marveling at how much his priorities had changed. Instead of discussing acquisition targets and profit margins, they were planning community education programs and advocacy campaigns. The work was challenging in different ways than corporate expansion, but it provided a sense of meaning that pure wealth accumulation had never offered. Chuck brought up the topic that had been on everyone's mind lately, the documentary film crew that wanted to make a movie about the Romanos incident and its aftermath. The producer seems legitimate, Chuck said, but I want to make sure any film about our work focuses on the real issues rather than just the celebrity drama of that night. Wellington agreed completely. The story isn't about me learning to be a better person. It's about systemic problems and how wealth and power operate in our society, and what individuals and communities can do to protect themselves. Tommy suggested they involve Mr. Romano and his staff in any documentary decisions, since their restaurant had been the setting for the original incident. Elena supported this idea, emphasizing that the Romano family should have control over how their story was told. The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from upcoming restaurant site visits to the legislative calendar for zoning reform initiatives. As they wrapped up, Wellington felt the familiar satisfaction that came from meaningful work done in collaboration with people he respected and trusted. After the others left, Wellington remained in the office to finish reviewing applications. Each file told a story of families pursuing the American dream through small business ownership, often facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The fund couldn't help every restaurant, but each successful intervention created a ripple effect throughout the community. His assistant knocked on the door to remind him of a dinner appointment. Wellington was meeting with a group of other wealthy business leaders who were interested in establishing similar community protection funds in their own cities. The Romanos incident had inspired copycats of the positive kind, successful entrepreneurs who wanted to use their resources for community benefit rather than personal enrichment. As Wellington prepared to leave the office, he noticed a framed photograph on his desk that Tommy had given him for Christmas. It showed the entire Romano's staff gathered around the table where the infamous confrontation had occurred, all smiling and raising glasses in a toast. Chuck Norris stood in the center with his arms around Mr. Romano and Elena, while Tommy held up the acceptance letter for his university scholarship. The photograph captured everything Wellington had learned about the difference between success and significance. Success was about accumulating resources and demonstrating dominance. Significance was about using those resources to create positive change that outlasted your own lifetime. His phone buzzed with a text message from Madison. "Dad, saw the news about the Ford Foundation grant. You're changing the world. Love you." Wellington smiled as he read his daughter's message. 6 months ago, she had been disappointed in his behavior toward restaurant staff. Now she was proud to tell her friends about his work protecting family businesses. The transformation had been worth every uncomfortable moment of self-examination and public accountability. As he walked out of the fund offices and toward his car, Wellington reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A moment of arrogance in an Italian restaurant had somehow led to discovering his life's true purpose. Chuck Norris had shown him that real strength came from protecting rather than dominating. Tommy Rodriguez had demonstrated that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. Elena Vasquez had proved that expertise was found in experience rather than education levels. Most importantly, Mr. Romano and his family had shown him that some things were indeed more valuable than money. Community, tradition, dignity, and the simple act of serving others with love and pride. Wellington's driver was waiting with the car, but before getting in, he looked back at the fund offices one more time. Tomorrow, they would help another family restaurant survive and thrive. Next week, they would testify before another city council about zoning reform. Next month, they would open their first regional office and hire their first local coordinator. The work would continue, one restaurant at a time, one community at a time, one transformed relationship at a time. It wasn't the legacy Wellington had originally planned for himself, but it was infinitely more meaningful than anything he could have imagined while sitting in that corporate boardroom plotting to acquire Romano's restaurant. Sometimes the best lessons come from our worst moments, and the most important victories are won not through conquest, but through surrender to something greater than ourselves. Marcus Wellington III had learned both lessons the hard way, but he had learned them well. And Romano's restaurant remained exactly where it belonged, in the hearts and hands of the family who had built it with 3 generations of love, one plate of pasta at a time. "But, sir, the Romanos deal alone could net us $15 million in development profits." "Harrison," Wellington interrupted, "some things are more valuable than money. I'm learning that lesson rather late in life, but better late than never." As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from Romano's, Wellington watched the restaurant disappear behind him and smiled. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of establishing the Family Restaurant Protection Fund. He would start using his wealth and influence to help rather than harm. And every time he faced a difficult business decision, he would remember the lesson that Chuck Norris and a 19-year-old waiter had taught him about the difference between power and strength. Back inside Romano's, the staff was cleaning up after what would go down as the most remarkable evening in the restaurant's 30-year history. Tommy carefully wiped down the tables, still trying to process everything that had happened. Elena counted tips, and marveled at how generous the customers had been after witnessing such an extraordinary display of human transformation. Chuck Norris finished his meal quietly, reflecting on how sometimes the most important battles are fought not with physical force but with moral courage and the willingness to stand up for what's right. As he left Romano's that night, he knew that he had witnessed something special, the moment when wealth and power chose to serve rather than dominate. The story of what happened at Romano's that evening would spread far beyond the confines of one restaurant, inspiring other business leaders to examine their own practices and encouraging ordinary people to stand up for their communities. But that would come later. For now, the Romano family went to bed knowing their restaurant was safe, their employees were protected, and their 3 decades of hard work would continue for generations to come. Why you want to be treated? I love you. The call ended, leaving Wellington standing in the middle of Romano's restaurant with his daughter's words echoing in his ears. Around him, the staff and customers waited to see what he would do next. Chuck Norris remained silent, allowing the billionaire to process this moment of clarity. Wellington looked at Tommy, seeing not just a clumsy waiter, but a young man with the same hopes and dreams his own daughter carried. He looked at Mr. Romano, seeing not just an obstacle to development, but a father who had built something lasting for his family. He looked around the restaurant and, finally, saw what everyone else had been trying to show him. This place was irreplaceable. Mr. Romano, Wellington said slowly, his voice completely different from the arrogant tone he had used earlier. I owe you much more than an apology. I owe you a promise. The restaurant held its collective breath as they waited to hear what that promise would be. Why concrete to me? Something about zoning committees always approving when the price is right? These mom and pop places never seeing it coming. Mr. Romano's weathered face crumpled with understanding and betrayal. You want to destroy my restaurant? My family has worked here for 30 years. This is not just business, this is our life. Wellington realized that his evening had gone from bad to catastrophic. Not only had he been humiliated in front of a room full of witnesses, but his predatory business practices were now exposed to someone who could make his life very difficult indeed. Mr. Romano, he said desperately, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions regarding your establishment. Chuck crossed his arms and settled in for what was clearly going to be a longer conversation than anyone had anticipated. The gentle jazz music continued playing in the background, providing an almost surreal soundtrack to the unfolding drama that would soon make Romano's restaurant the most famous Italian place in the city. Wellington froze, his hand halfway to his phone. His face went through a series of expressions as the information processed. Disbelief, recognition, and then something approaching terror flickered across his features. Chuck Norris? He repeated weakly. That's right. Chuck confirmed pleasantly. Now, about that apology to Tommy.